Hi guys, and welcome to this video where I'll be teaching you how to use for loops in Java. For loops to a beginner can seem quite complicated and scary, but I promise you after this video you should have a working understanding of how and when to use for loops. So the first thing we need to do is to create a Java project. I'll call my Java project for loop and I will create it. I'm writing this in an IDE called Eclipse, which you can download from the description down below. An IDE is just a fancy text editor which you can use to write and run Java code. The next thing I need to do is I need to create a class. A class is just a fancy name for a Java file which we will use to write our Java code. I will also call this for loop and I'll make sure that it has a main method. A main method, this thing, is very important because it's the block of code that runs when we try to run our code later. So let's say we wanted to write a program which outputs the numbers from 1 to 5. There's a solution to this problem which instantly jumps out, which is to write a print statement for each one of the numbers from 1 to 5. So we can use this, we can do this by writing a print statement and having the numbers and then simply just copy and pasting this 5 times. So that's 5, and then you can go through and you can replace all the numbers, which as you can already see is quite a fiddly and time consuming process. If I wanted to do this from the numbers from 1 to 100, it would take an incredibly long amount of time and it would take a very large amount of lines of code. So the point being is that it's very inefficient. It's not an elegant solution to this problem. Programming in general is all about being as lazy as possible. And usually the laziest way to do something is the most concise way to do something. So a better solution to this problem is to use a for loop. A for loop uses a process called iteration. Iteration sounds like a scary word, but all it means is to loop through a block of code multiple times. And it's really useful. So if you have a block of code or a line of code that you need to execute for a given number of times, instead of just writing them over and over and over and over again, you can write a loop around them, and then the loop will make sure that that block of code executes for the amount of times you tell it to execute. Writing a for loop is quite simple. All you need to do is use the keyword for, which tells Java that we're writing a for loop, and then you need a set of brackets. Within these brackets, we need to write the condition to Java that will tell it how many times the for loop needs to execute. Now this is a 3-step process. The first thing we need to do is we need to create a counter variable. The counter variable we're creating here is int I equals 1, and what that means is we need to create an integer variable I and give that the value of the number 1. An integer variable is just a number variable. It's just a letter that holds a number or a name that holds a number. Now counter variables are super useful because what this is going to do is it's going to track the number of times the for loop is executed. So we write a semicolon here which says to Java our statement is done. The next thing we need to do is we need to write a conditional. And the conditional is going to be something that is checked against the counter, and if the conditional comes back as true, then the for loop will execute. So in this case, we need I to be less than or equal to 5. Because for each loop of the for loop, we're going to be increasing I by 1. So after 5 executions, I will be 6, and I will no longer be less than or equal to 5, and the for loop will terminate and it will no longer execute. And so we won't get extra lines of code that we don't want in our solution. So we write another semicolon which tells Java that our statement is finished, and we have a third step now, which is the step that changes what the counter is. In this case we can just write I++, which just tells Java that you want to increase the I variable by 1. So that is the for loop completely declared. All we need to do next is we need a pair of squiggly brackets, and the squiggly brackets just tells Java when a code block begins and when a code block ends. So all this is saying is that when this for loop executes, run the code between those 2 brackets. Now we can write anything in these brackets at all and it will run 5 times. So in this case, to solve our problem of outputting the numbers from 1 to 5, we can write system.out.println, and we can write, and then we can print something, and that thing will be printed 5 times. So if we print this with 1 in the print line, hopefully when it runs, it should output the number 1 5 times. Now the thing is, we need to make sure that this print line outputs 1 to 5. We need to make sure that it's changing. But thankfully, we have a variable, our counter variable, which changes from 1 to 5 based on where the loop is in its execution cycle. So when it loops the first time, I will be 1. When it loops the second time, I will be 2. When it loops the third time, I will be 3. And so all we need to do here is we need to write I in the brackets. And then each time the for loop executes, it will print the value of I. So it will print 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is our desired result. So if we run this now, it should, there we go, it should produce the desired output 1 to 5, which it does. Now you can do this. The reason why this is useful, 1 to 5 can quite quickly just be written with 5 print line statements. But if we wanted to do the values from 1 to 100, that would take us ages to copy and paste print lines from 1 to 100. We can use this now, and if we run this, it will output the numbers from 1 to 100 for us in the console. And that is just 3 lines of code, and it's outputting 100 times. And that's why it's so useful. If you have a large block of code or a very important block of code that you need to execute multiple times, it can take up a lot of space in your program if you just write them by rote. If you just write a block of code once and then below it and below it and below it to do it the 3 or 4 times. Instead, you can just wrap it in a loop, and it's a super concise and super elegant solution to the problems that you want to solve. Now, for loops aren't the only loop in Java. You have for loops and while loops. And for loops are useful when you specifically know the amount of times that a loop is going to execute. So say if I had a problem where I needed this line of code to execute 5 times, that would be a perfect situation for a for loop, because you can just write a condition that makes sure that it runs 5 times. A while loop's a little bit different, because you can have open while loops where if you're not sure the amount of times that the loop should execute, you can use a while loop and it will just run until a certain condition is met. So say if you were programming a game and you wanted to run until there was a win state in that game, that would be an excellent situation for a while loop. I hope that you learned something, and I hope now that you should be able to go away and write some for loops of your own. In order to commit this to memory, I'd recommend that you go away and you write a program that computes the factorial of a number. This should be quite a challenging program for a beginner, but if you use a for loop, you should be able to get it. I hope that you learned something from this video, and if you did, I'd be incredibly grateful if you gave it a like below and a subscribe for more Java and programming videos in the future. Have a great day, happy coding, and I'll see you in the next one.